remind me to record each week. So.
Well, I think it was Kate who originally brought that up.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I'm recording. Yes. Thank you. If you'll give me 1 second, I'm going to turn on.
I think he's dealing with kids.
Oh.
Dealing with kids.
Yeah, that something was 2 little boys running around in the background. So Kate knows all about that, right?
Yes.
So, okay, I am recording, so let me share my screen and we will get started. So this is session 7. It's hard to believe we've been 7 weeks now studying Paul's letter to the Romans. And today we're going to look at the final chapter. And this particular chapter, Romans 16, is missing from some of our early manuscripts of Romans. And that has led some scholars to think it was maybe added later. 1533, we looked at last week, certainly can be the ending of the letter with the final blessing. But I think there's some good reasons why this is probably part of Paul's original letter. And I think the biggest reason is that it reflects what scholars refer to as the movement from the particular to the general. And what they mean by that is that most of our New Testament documents, especially the letters from Paul and others, were written to particular communities at a particular moment in time for a particular purpose. And therefore, there are details contained in the letters, specifically things like greetings and personal details regarding the relationship between the sender and the community that don't apply once these letters began to be more widely circulated and began to be used in more general purposes. For example, worship, public reading during liturgy, and so forth. So that makes perfect sense that this letter this chapter is full of personal greetings and information that kind of pertains to that particular moment. And it would make sense that when this got read in churches a generation or two later, that would have been dropped. And so that explains in part why it's missing from some of those early manuscripts. But I think as a part of the letter, it really makes sense that Paul is wrapping things up. He's talking about coming to, I'm just going to check on just 1 second. We had someone else join us here. Oh, that's I think that's Kathy back with us. Is that Kathy back with us?
It is. I'm just going to listen.
Okay, great. Okay, so the first part of this chapter is directed towards the recipients, those who are going to receive this, and Paul sending greetings to those particular individuals. And I think there are a couple reasons for this, but the main reason is that in some ways this is a letter of recommendation for Paul, showing that he's well informed and well connected. There are more greetings in Romans than in some of the other letters. And I think perhaps this reflects the fact that Paul has never been to Rome. He knows some folks there. He's worked with some of these people in other contexts. And so he's widely sharing these greetings with those particular individuals. I think, Paul probably wasn't beyond name dropping, right? As he's getting ready to go to Jerusalem and then to Rome. These are folks that he knows are well respected, and if he's in that company, that gives a certain level of credence to his own ministry and what he's just written to them. In particular, this list has a lot to say about women in leadership. And one person in particular, Phoebe, who is referred to as a deacon. The Greek word there is diakonos. It's important to note that the orders of ministry that we think of in the church today, deacons, priests, and bishops, that was not quite formed yet when Paul was writing. That came about a generation or so later. However, we do see these terms, deacon, elder, bishop, or overseer, being used in the early letters of the church by both Paul and Peter and John. So even though it's not a formal structure yet, clearly these are emerging positions within the church, emerging roles of leadership and participation within the wider community. So Phoebe clearly had some leadership role. She's the bearer of Paul's letter, and some scholars think she might have been like a financial representative. She brought the letter and also kind of laid the groundwork and maybe even did some fundraising for Paul in Rome before he arrived or was anticipated to arrive. But there are other women in this list, and they're not just named. They are referred to as leaders, those who have labored with Paul. So Prisca is named with Aquila, Mary, two names, Tryphena and Tryphosa, which could be sisters since they're similar in spelling. A woman named Persis, the mother of Rufus, who Paul says was like a mother to him. And then there's this very interesting name, Junia, in the list. We don't know for sure if this was a female name or not. But if it was, and there's good reason to believe it was, if this is a woman, Paul describes her as a relative who was in prison with him, who was prominent among the apostles, and who was in Christ even before Paul. So this is someone whose ministry would then predate Paul's apostolic ministry. And that could be really significant if indeed Junia was a woman, that the early evidence of women in leadership in the church. So after the personal greetings that Paul is sending to individuals in Rome, there's a short word of warning against dissension, which again makes sense if Paul is kind of bringing things to a close, that he wants to remind them once again that there will be some among them who will try to cause division and dissension, who will disagree with Paul's teaching. And so just be mindful and be careful of those who would, with smooth talk and flattery, deceive the hearts of the simple-minded. I love that phrase. And then finally, Paul names those that are with him or have worked with him who are also sending greetings. Timothy is one of the more well-known folks that works with Paul because we have letters to Timothy. We know a bit about their relationship as mentor and mentee, really a father-son kind of relationship. Paul describes three, what he calls relatives, Lucius, Jason, and Sosipater. Remarkably, the person who wrote the letter, the scribe to whom Paul dictated the letter most likely, he identifies himself, I, Tertius, the writer of this letter, greet you in the name of the Lord. There's another name further along, Quartus. These two names mean third and fourth. And so these could have been slaves. That slaves would have often been named according to their rank or their ordering. And so these could very possibly be slaves who Paul took under his wing or liberated in some way. The host that they were staying with, Gaius, is named, and the city treasurer, Erastus, is named. Why is this so significant? I think it's fascinating to think about all these people who were part of the community that Paul worked with. They had, let's call them staff meetings together. I mean, these are people that Paul probably talked about his theological ideas with. I said to the morning group, any preacher or teacher in the church knows that the public presentation, the sermon, the teaching, whatever, is always formed in the context of various conversations, and especially if it's a difficult topic, I call up a friend who's a priest, and we talk through the scriptures. So these are people that Paul probably worked very closely with in terms of his own ministry. And I just find that fascinating because we sort of picture Paul as this distant person kind of unto himself, and yet he was part of this community of leaders who were the movers and shakers in the early church. Then there's a concluding doxology and a final blessing, and a final word of praise to God, which again is pretty typical of Paul's letters. So that's an overview of chapter 16. So let's come back and just have some conversation about what you all, what your takeaways were specifically about chapter 16. We're going to come back and do some reflecting on the whole letter. But yeah, Paul, I've muted you all, and for some reason I've lost my ability to the new version of Zoom. I have to ask you to unmute. I guess it's more polite.
Are you unmuted?
Yep, you're unmuted.
All right. When I read 16, the thing that struck me the most is the names. They do not appear to be very Jewish, to be honest. And it seems that the people he is highlighting in his, for the most part, sound like Gentile names to me.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
I really don't know. That's a great question. They do sound very Greek. However, it wouldn't have been uncommon at this stage for the Greek sort of transliteration or Greek version of the name, like Peter. His name, in Greek was Cephas, but I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
What do you think, Ian?
I think it's an interesting point.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
But it goes against a thesis that I've developed. So that in particular with chapter 16, but I read through the entire book today in almost one sitting. I broke for lunch just to get a sense, because I wanted to sort of, and my thesis in this particular, it's exactly what Doug was saying. This is name dropping. Mm-hmm. And I have a feeling that these are names that could be used as a way of furthering his relationship with the Romans. But my thesis, which I will not say now, I'll wait till we go into the general discussion, it could be another audience.
Yeah. Good. Now I'm waiting with bated breath, right? Other thoughts on chapter 16 as you read these final words? I mean, sometimes people just gloss over it and the bunch of greetings to a bunch of people I can't pronounce their names, right? But this is another example, like, say, the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew and Luke. When you take the time to read it and really think about it, there's a lot of interesting insights into, in this case, the makeup of the community. I mean, I didn't make a list of the names and see what percentage are female, but a good percentage are female names, and I think that strikes people as pretty significant.
And it does, and like I say, the net I took out of 16 was that the early Roman Christian church was more Gentiles than Jewish, because the Jews were in fact run out of Rome, what was it, in 40,
mm-hmm.
somewhere around 40, 50. They were blamed for discontent, so they forced them out for a while. So the net I took out of 16 is that the early Roman Christian church was in fact converted Gentiles.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's exactly the debate, right? I think it's around the year 48 that the Jews were expelled under Claudius.
Right.
So Paul's probably writing about a decade later. So some of them have probably made their way back, but precisely the makeup of the congregation or the community is still a matter of debate. And chapters 9 through 11 can go either way in my mind. I mean, either there's a Jewish audience and Paul is writing to reassure them, or it is primarily a Gentile audience and he's writing to kind of refute some of their claims or some of their objections. So I think it's a complicated question. But other takeaways from chapter 16. Yeah, Debbie.
I just think because he's not there yet, and he does make such a big review in the whole letter, that if someone had a question, he's sort of anointing these people to guide newbies into the fold. And by naming them, it kind of gives them some authority to be welcoming to new potential Christians.
Yeah. Well, certainly for Phoebe. I mean, certainly Phoebe is sent as kind of an ambassador for Paul, right? Welcome her in the Lord as is fitting for the saints. Help her in whatever she may require from you, for she has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. So Phoebe has I gather from that a pretty significant role, at least in Paul's ministry. So he is entrusting quite a bit of responsibility to her. Yeah. But I think, to go back to what I said earlier, I think it's fascinating to think, I just sort of picture Paul sailing on a ship by himself to these various places and doing ministry. And yet that's highly unlikely, right? There's many, many people who were working with him. And some of them probably had a similar status as Paul in some of these communities where they were, when they came to town, they were like Prisca and Aquila. I could see them as a married couple going in and doing missionary work either before Paul or after, and they were widely regarded and respected in the community. And I said to the morning group, I'm waiting for the day when we have an archaeological discovery and we find a letter to Paul from it'd be great to have a letter from one of these cities. We know that the Corinthian church wrote to Paul because he says they wrote to him. We don't have those letters, but what if we had a letter from Phoebe, or what if we had a letter from Prisca and Aquila saying, hey, we just left Corinth, here's what's going on. I just think that would be awesome to have that kind of contextual connection there with Paul. But so that's kind of a biblical scholar's dream, right? Yeah. Sue and then Debbie.
I was going to say that following what you've just said, that'd be a wonderful thing to take on as, say, an essay topic. If someone were going to just imagine what that letter might be, just following using the same language and form, and I just think it'd be a wonderful exercise.
I would do the Bob Newhart version of that. If you know his thing where he says he's Abraham Lincoln's agent, and he says, why are you taking the train? I mean, you can get there anyway. And what's this back of the envelope stuff? So.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Well,
I can imagine Phoebe kvetching at him and saying, why are you always whining about these things?
Right. Yeah. And there are, I can't think of an example offhand, but there are some really interesting fictional books that have taken some of these obscure characters like a Phoebe and just sort of created a whole, kind of experience and world in which that person lives and does ministry. And it's interesting to think about that. Debbie?
I think too, we have to recall that Paul's experience in the Jewish tradition, women were not involved in Sanhedrin or any of these exclusive study groups or authority groups, and that Paul is really blazing a new trail in many ways by bringing men and women, Jew and Gentile, just across, across so many divisions, to bring them all together. It's such a difference, I would think, even from his point of view.
Yeah. And that's why some of the more problematic texts in the Corinthian correspondence and the pastoral epistles like Timothy, there are those who clearly want to say that's not Paul, that's a later interpolation or interjection. I'm more of the mindset that, he's speaking to specific situations, and you have to interpret those within the wider context of all that Paul wrote. Because I think when you step back and look at everything that Paul wrote, or at least what we have of what he wrote, clearly it's a very inclusive community that he is fostering and cultivating. So.
Inclusive, you mean by education and literacy and being really the upper end of the societies?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. There's a great study by Luke Timothy Johnson at Emory University. He's since retired, but he looks at all of these major transitions that Christianity had to make culturally, geographically, linguistically. And one of them was this socioeconomic transition, that the earliest disciples were fishermen and merchants, and very quickly, as it went into these big urban centers like Corinth and Thessalonica and Philippi, there were wealthy people, aristocrats, who became benefactors of the church. And there's some evidence that these early house churches, they essentially went and found the richest person with the biggest house, and tried to convert them so that they'd have the biggest space for worship. And so, but by doing that, it kind of became a very diverse community, because you had merchants, because we know Paul preached in the public square, and so he's preaching to merchants and lower economic folks, and yet they probably had some benefactors. Maybe Phoebe comes from one of those families as a benefactor.
Doug, would you mind telling me the name of that author again?
Luke Timothy Johnson.
I would be more persuaded by him if he had a more Christian name.
I know, exactly, right?
Timothy, the son of John.
Exactly. Yeah, he's probably, it's hard to put these things in a ranking, but I'd put him in the top 10 20th century New Testament scholars, at least the last half of the 20th century. So, Kate?
I was just going to say, when you mention these women in chapter 16, it's just so interesting to me that not only in chapter 16, but a few times in Romans, there have been these places where, I've read plenty of the Bible, but I haven't read Romans. But there have been these places where I have these beliefs, and maybe it's because I'm a cradle Episcopalian and it's just in there and I don't know that I've learned it. But, when I come across other believers who say, we don't think that women should be in a position of authority at all, I know in my heart that's not what I believe, and I can't tell them scripturally why I don't believe that. But then to read Romans and just have several times in there have these beliefs that I hold dear, kind of just spelled out for me or laid out for me, like, there's a reason we believe this. And just to have the Episcopal Church constantly kind of reaffirm that they're the right church for me and the way that we study the Bible, it's just really rewarding.
Yeah, no, that's well said. And, and it's one of those things where, again, in my opinion, a deep reading of these texts really, brings these things to the surface in a way that is really powerful and meaningful. So good. Good.
What was it, 200 when they
So
started?
that's kind of a good segue. We're at the halfway point. It's about 3:30. But you reflected on, that chapter 16 connected some dots for you with the whole letter, and for you, Kate, some of those themes. We can come back to 16 at the end to kind of wrap things up. But let's transition and chat just a bit about your learning and what are you taking away from this study? What surprised you? What still challenges you? What new theories have you developed about Paul's? I don't know. I'm waiting to see what the theory is. But so what's your takeaway? Yeah, Paul?
The biggest one I took away, I looked at Paul's stuff for many years, ever since I've been a teenager, by the way. My godmother gave me Paul's story on my 11th birthday. So it's from that age on, Paul happens to be my favorite. But as I read through the letter to the Romans, I put myself in two shoes, one Jewish and one Gentile. And the net of the letter to the Romans, as a Gentile, oh man, this is easy. This guy is right on. His words are great stuff. If I were a Jewish person, I would find more difficulty in accepting all that Paul says.
Mm-hmm.
It's, it's a new covenant. The laws are not the most important thing in life, and yet, as if I were a Jew, that's what I was brought up in.
Mm-hmm.
It's like being a Christian and going to a parochial school through elementary through 8th grades. When you come out of there, let me tell you, you love religion.
Yeah.
So, as a Jew, I would have had difficulty with some of the things that are in Paul.
Yeah. Well, I think Paul, as he said in the beginning, unashamed of the gospel, right? Jesus is the lens through which he now sees everything. That his entire worldview now is through his own, and I believe, reading Paul, that it is his own encounter with the risen Christ, and his own participation in the death and rising of Christ. For Paul, that is not just a theological idea, that in baptism we die and rise again. That's something he experienced in his life. And so that becomes the lens for everything. So clearly he's writing to Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, but the common denominator is, it is through Christ.
Right.
Yeah. Ian, I can't wait any longer.
Oh, well, I wasn't going to go into my thesis. I was going to respond to what Paul said.
Oh, okay.
And say, on the other hand, in chapters 9 through 11, he goes to enormous lengths to first, as I said the couple of times ago, he actually deliberately puts himself in the role that Moses was with God, with Yahweh on the mountain when the Israelites had their blasphemous uprising with the golden calf incident, where Moses said to God, if you're going to cut off this people, you cut me off first. In verse 3 of chapter 9, he immediately leads with that, right? So, for I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ, which is a huge thing for Paul, for the sake of my brethren, my kinsmen by race.
Mm-hmm.
So he is saying, he's really reasserting his identity as a Jew, because he is the Gentile guy, right? I mean, in the Jerusalem church, he's the Gentile guy. So, is he reasserting this identity? And he goes to great lengths to make sure that the Jewish people in particular are not overly offended by saying, for example, with the parable of the olive tree that's been cultivated by God, which is the Israelites, the people, the children of Abraham,
Right.
Isaac and Jacob.
Right.
And with the grafting in of the wild olive branch, which is the Gentiles, but that in no way says that if we can graft in a wild olive branch, wow, we're really going to want to get those cultivated olive branches back on the main trunk of the vine. So I think that he's really I understand what you're saying, but he is really trying to put out an olive branch, if you will, to the Hebrews. So my thesis is that I can't remember when I read this today because this came to me sort of midway or late through, is that the Roman Church, I think, is a highly respected but neutral church. I think he says somewhere he implies that this was not, obviously it was not planted by him. He said that from the very beginning. But it wasn't planted by any of the other apostles either that knew Jesus. Do you see what I'm saying? This is a church that sort of formed on its own. It's sort of the study group of churches where people had heard these ideas, they gathered to discuss them, and they became strong believers without the guidance of a mentor, who was a pagan, by the way, Doug. You know who Mentor was? Right. Mentor was Odysseus's friend, and actually he was older than Odysseus, who took Odysseus' son Telemachus. So really, instead of saying mentee, you should say his Telemachus. Right. Telemachus under his wing. So in any event, sorry.
I had forgotten all that, so.
Yeah. But I think that what he's doing is he is trying to woo these neutral Christians to at least be sympathetic to him in anticipation that he's about to go for the showdown at the OK Corral in Jerusalem. So that if he's imprisoned by either the urgings of the Jerusalem church because there's bad blood somewhere, or by those whom he called, what did he call them? The unbelievers in Judea that he was going to face, right?
Right.
That the Roman church would come to his defense.
Mm-hmm.
So this is my thesis, is that this is a letter to the Romans that's really meant for the the Jerusalem church.
Mm-hmm.
And that he is trying to get an ally to have his back should the worst comes to the worst.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I thought in chapter 16, a lot of that name dropping, I would suspect, given my thesis, that even though they sound like Gentile names, that these are people who had truck in the Jerusalem church because they're people who would be respected by them. So, well, if Phoebe's on his side, then maybe we should give him another look, or that sort of thing.
Right.
So
No, I think that's well grounded, and there are others who certainly share that view, and it totally makes sense when you read the other letters of Paul. Paul rarely spends as much time meticulously laying out an argument the way he does in Romans. Most of the time, he just says, this is the way it is, right? In part because he's already in relationship with those churches. So we can assume that when he went to Corinth, he preached and they knew the content of his preaching. So he didn't have to reiterate that in the letter. He was reinforcing and simply stating what he believed to be true. And in some cases, you might say, with a bit of arrogance and cockiness, with the Galatians, right? Sometimes people think Paul can be a bit arrogant. But I think in that case, he has such a deep relationship with that church already that he can just, say, hey guys, you're way off track. You've screwed up. Here's the truth. He is so much more nuanced and careful in the way he crafts the letter to the Romans. And so it totally fits with what Ian is saying. He is laying out his gospel in a way that hopefully the Roman church will embrace. We can assume they already have a basic gospel that has been proclaimed to them to some extent, but Paul is clearly saying, this is the gospel of which I am not ashamed. And he lays it all out there. And so, yeah, what his motivations are is hard to tell, but it certainly makes sense that this church at the center of the empire, to come to Paul's aid should he get into trouble, makes a lot of sense.
Well, I agree with all of that. And even in this letter, I've always read with a little different tone to it, and that is his goal was, in fact, Spain.
Mm-hmm.
But going through to Spain, he obviously needs a stopover. He's going to the church in Rome. Now, nothing tells us where the root of the Roman church, and not calling it a church, it wasn't a church, it was a Roman community, the Christian community in Rome. We don't know what their basic training, what their basic theories they had of religion, who instructed them.
Right.
I mean, this didn't come out of the blue. Someone instructed them. And Paul, being Paul, says, hey, this is the right thing. His theology is the right thing in Paul's mind. Right. So he presents his theology in the first parts of the Romans, and he's planting this theology in their mind. So when he makes his stopover on his way, he can then develop that further. Yeah. And if you look at, the series of names, it's not a small community. They must be doing pretty well. Yeah. So the issue then becomes, excuse me.
It's the Holy Ghost.
It's the Holy Ghost. It is. I keep forgetting to do that. But anyway.
But yeah.
And the fact that he then is arrested after he writes this letter, because he hasn't still gone back to Jerusalem, and he gets arrested. And when he ends up in Rome, he ends up as a prisoner. Yeah. For the 2 years. And so I think it's truly Paul. He has a theology that he firmly believes is the right theology for Christians to have.
Yeah. What's interesting though is he's not refuting somebody else's theology, or at least not explicitly, right? So like in Galatians and 1 Corinthians, he's clearly saying, hey, someone has come in and taught you a different gospel.
Right.
And let me set you straight, or where he clearly sort of, maybe just out of politeness, accepts what the Romans are doing, but then offers his own, well, not just his own, but I mean his own gospel argument. But well, we haven't heard from Sherry, Emily, Kate, anything else you want to add to what's your takeaway? Joe?
Well, this is a huge learning process for me, having never really studied the Gospels at all. And I'm amazed when people start saying, well, in all three, or this refers to this, refers to that. It's amazing. So I'm on a journey, listening and learning and thoroughly enjoying it. That's about what I can say.
That's good.
That's perfect. I've spent time earlier today and now while we're all talking, and I just keep looking back at the doxology at the end. Because it speaks to me so clearly that he is bringing the Jews, his goal is to bring the Jews and the Gentiles into the same faith. And he is actually talking about the writings of the prophets, but Jesus Christ. And he makes, at the command of the eternal God, made known to all the Gentiles that they may believe and obey. But he references that belief by saying that it's based in the mysteries hidden for the ages in the writings of the prophets, and so on. So I love this, that his to me, I could be wrong, his goal is that all are Christians together, and that the Christians should know that the Jewish antecedents are part of their own antecedents, and he's clearly writing to the Jews to tell them, somebody else was saying this, that you're the trunk of the olive tree. And then Christianity evolves not only out of that, but through it and with it and in it, and he's pulling them together, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's right on, and thank you for bringing us back to that doxology, because I do want to make a comment on that. Kate, do you want to chime in at all?
Sure. Two things. One, it's interesting that Ian noticed that Moses was quoted in chapter 9, because I specifically wrote down where Moses was quoted in chapter 10, and it just goes along the whole lines of that he's possibly priming this community. And so he goes to someone who they trust and look up to. And now this is from the Message, so it's paraphrased, but he says, when you see God reach out to people who you think are religiously infantile, inferior, or outsiders, you will throw temper tantrums. Mm-hmm. So I like that, he's just kind of saying someone that you trust and you grew up with and studied, he knows this is going to happen too. So it's not just me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it points to the deeper issue that, whether this is a Jew or Jewish or Gentile congregation, for a long time, people read this as lacking many of the references to Judaism that Paul picks up in other letters. But as I said at the start, Kathy Grieb and others have pointed out that there's an underlying story that is assumed people have a knowledge of, right? It's assumed that they kind of know the basic story of Abraham, and that they're going to pick up on these internal references and echoes of the Genesis 3 story or the Moses story, right? He doesn't come right out and say, let me tell you about Moses and the golden calf. And, he doesn't have to tell them the story. It's assumed that they know the story. So that points to maybe, a stronger suggestion that there was a good makeup of Jewish Christians there, precisely because he doesn't have to retell everything. He can just let that story hang in the background, and everything else that he's building in terms of his argument assumes that people know that basic story. So that's good.
And then my takeaway was just for me to keep going through the whole book of Romans over and over, and the notes that we took on each chapter, and to just kind of condense it down into a message from my own kind of reference and understanding. And so what I wrote was just that for all those who cry out for God, what you do for God alone, trusting God, not yourself, in carrying out this great assignment of spreading God's love, bringing your brother alongside you, and continually dying to sin, knowing that you still operate within the limitations of sin. And I noticed that in chapter 15, I think it was chapter 15, Paul says that I say all of this to you because it has worked for me. I'm telling you that this is the way to live a successful Christian life and to bring more Christians alongside you, because it has worked for me. Mm-hmm. And what really resounded with me about that is that I grew up with my dad always telling me that the commandments are laid out for us, not because God wants to feels good about putting rules over you, but that he created you and he knows how you will live happily. He knows that if you commit adultery or murder or covet other people, you will not be happy and you'll hurt those around you, and the sin becomes exponential. So the fact that he kind of said that same thing, I'm doing this because it's worked, really resounded to me. And just, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's very Pauline of you. No, because that's what Paul says about the law, right? That the law is not bad. It was there for a purpose, and it was actually part of God's covenant faithfulness to us. And that the law of Christ, what we live under today, that law of love, is there for that same purpose. Yeah, and it worked for Paul, right? He's speaking out of his own experience. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Other thoughts, Debbie or Emily, or got it all?
I'm just overwhelmed at his bursting of energy, and I can hardly imagine his, secretary trying to keep up with, all his logical arguments and everything. But it's just overwhelming, his knowledge and logic. He's been on both sides of the coin, having persecuted Christians and now creating knowledge of Christ and spreading the word to those who don't know him at all. It's just wonderful that he was chosen to spread the word of Jesus Christ's life and our the new covenant that we have with God, the new promise that everyone God wants. It's just great.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking, I wouldn't want to be Tertius, right? It's sort of like drinking from a fire hose, right? Just the intensity of that. Yeah, Emily. I have to
You're muted.
Can you fix?
Okay.
There you go.
So anyway, when I look at these things, when I jot down these things on the notes, I like to live in the moment. And of course, there's so many moments going on. And you see these different things that I had written. For instance, the law isn't bad, but it has been manipulated. I have down on my paper. Law was good, but couldn't accomplish what was needed. So there's things that are in here that are very applicable to today. And I'm more into, instead of looking at it from the past, looking how his word fits into what's going on today.
Yeah, it's good. I agree. Yeah, there's a lot in here. I think
it's a horrible time, and I want to commend the Episcopal priests and bishops for their support of holding a Bible in front of a church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know Bishop Buddy in Washington, and
oh, she's fantastic. She was on there in a flash.
Yeah.
And the presiding bishop is a nice thing that he printed out today.
Yeah, it's good. Well, I want to go to the doxology for a moment. The last couple chapters. I was interested that Ian sat down and read the whole letter today again, because that's how it would have been experienced more than likely, whether it was read in the context of liturgy or just read at a gathering as a matter of teaching and instruction. But they didn't do what we do in Romans 3:1b through 4A, 3A or something. they sat down and listened to the whole letter. And so all of these threads that get woven throughout the whole letter, you see them and hear them much more clearly if you read it in one sitting. But also these almost liturgical moments, right? These doxologies and these moments of high praise that come in the letter. You can almost see the gathered community right there with Paul, right, as they're listening to these arguments, and then all of a sudden you can like chapter 11. Now to him who is beyond all human understanding, and just this whole word of praise and doxology. The same thing happens here at the end of chapter 16. Now to God who is able to strengthen you according to my gospel. So there's Paul right there, my gospel, and the proclamation of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery. Two really important words there. One is mystery, and for Paul, and for the kind of wider philosophical world in his time, mystery wasn't like something that had to be solved. It was something that could be known but not known fully, right? And could only be known through revelation. So this mystery, and Paul says it much more clearly in 1 Corinthians, where he says, this has been hidden, right? It's been there, but we haven't seen it. And for Paul, the moment of disclosure, the moment of revelation was the Christ event, the life, death, resurrection of Jesus. So this mystery that God has been working out really since before the foundation of the world, if you read Ephesians, has now been made known through the Christ event, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But this word, where is it? Revelation, in Greek is the word apocalypse. And so we typically hear that word as some future event, right? The apocalypse is the end of the world, or the future ending of the world. But for Paul and other Christians, the first apocalypse, the first revelation, was the death and resurrection of Jesus, right? That was an apocalyptic moment, this moment of revelation. And there will be a second apocalypse, a second revelation, a second coming yet to come. And so we live between these two moments of revelation. And so there's sort of it's an unfolding revelation that the church is part of. And so in Ephesians, I think it's Ephesians 2, Paul says that the role of the church is to make known this revelation to the heavens, right? Not just to the earth, but to the heavenly powers and authorities, to make known the revelation that God has disclosed through Christ. So I just want us to get into that world, that this is a big deal for Paul, this mystery, this apocalypse that has happened through Christ. Through the prophetic writings is made known to the Gentiles, according to the command of the eternal God, to bring about the obedience of faith, and then to the only wise God through Jesus Christ, to whom be the glory forever. Amen. Powerful way to end the letter. So, what time are we at now? Oh, it's almost 4 o'clock. So we're going to meet next week if you want to. I don't know if I can do a 3 o'clock next week. How many could come to an 11 if I can only do 11 next Wednesday?
Yeah.
You don't know, Kate?
Yeah, I think
It's not as
I think we can.
It's not imperative. There's just some lingering issues in Romans that some folks have wanted to talk about. There's a part in chapter 1 that has been interpreted as sort of Paul's approach to issues of homosexuality. There's a couple other passages related to authority and maybe go back to chapter 13. But there's a couple other ones that I thought we'd just circle back around and have some conversation about that weren't necessarily integral to Paul's arguments. So I didn't want to linger too long on them because I wanted to get the whole letter sort of as a whole. But if you want to join us next week at 11, we'll do that for an hour or so. Then we'll take a break because some of the staff and myself are going to be on and off a vacation for the rest of June and July as we get into the summer months. Then we'll kind of pick back up in late July or August with the next series. Bye, Emily. Oh, are you leaving?
Or she wants to talk.
Or do you want to talk?
She's muted.
She's muted.
She has to unmute.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you, I heard today that the bishop isn't going to allow us in the church until the end of June. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So the earliest we will have worship will be the first or second week of July at this point. Yeah.
Nothing outdoors?
What's that?
Outdoors, maybe, or no?
Yeah, we're looking at a couple different options. In fact, we have a meeting tonight, and so there'll likely be indoor options, outdoor options. Yeah. So, but when we do resume Bible studies, hopefully we'll be able to have an on-site component by August or September. But we're hoping to continue to be able to offer a Zoom option so that people can participate that way as well.
I would love that. I've always wanted to do the Bible study with you at 11. And so if there's any way you can do a Zoom component, I'd super love that.
Yeah. And I would love to consistently offer more than one section. I can't guarantee that when we're back in the full swing of things and regular office hours and everything, I'll be able to do 2 sections a day, but we'll try our best to offer different options. And I mean, I want to get more lay people involved in leading Bible studies and have more offerings and things like that. So these are all things we can work on as we move forward. So, well, thank you all. I have really enjoyed studying Romans. I really, I like this cohort a lot because it's smaller and we can all chat, which is really good. So it's good.
Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. We have to. It should go away. Oops. Meeting.
All right. You guys doing well, Ian?
I had 4 more points to talk about, but
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I always say too much anyway.
You want to chat about them now?
Sure.
Yeah. What are your 4 points?
Well, you have my thesis, and I did mention that